Shadow, it's me again. Are you upset with me for something?
One of the things that many Sonic fans enjoy about the games, comics, movies, and TV shows is the wide variety of relationship dynamics between Sonic and the other characters. Of course, there are the wholesome friendships that have touched the hearts of many gamers and are adored by fans. The rivalries are unique in their own way and keep the fans entertained. And while there hasn't been a confirmed love interest, many fans enjoy shipping Sonic with a lot of characters. Needless to say, fans will mostly focus on the relationships centered around Sonic, naturally, as he is the main character. But what about the relationships that don't involve Sonic? One of my favorite relationships that I enjoy analyzing is between Shadow the Hedgehog and Dr. Eggman, Sonic's #1 rival and #1 enemy. I've seen many fans analyze the dynamic between Sonic and Eggman, or even Sonic and Shadow, but we don't see a lot of discussion with Shadow and Eggman. From what I've observed, most fans tend to believe that Shadow is neutral when it comes to working with Eggman and has a moderate dislike of Sonic. The Sonic Boom series might be to blame for that, but I disagree. If anything, Shadow seems to like Sonic, though he won't openly admit it. And if anything, Shadow despises Eggman, and for good reason. Shadow and Eggman have one of the most toxic relationships in the Sonic franchise. So toxic that it makes Mario and Bowser look healthy in comparison. Historically, Eggman has gaslit, manipulated, and psychologically abused Shadow in many ways, such as making him question the validity of his existence, bartering with misleading information as a means to control him, and even targeting the people that Shadow cares deeply about. Interestingly, Eggman shows a hint of respect for Sonic, but you might be surprised when I say, Eggman does not respect Shadow in the slightest. There's an unspoken power imbalance between these two that I feel gets overlooked among Sonic fans. Keep in mind, Dr. Eggman is a grown adult and has a track record of being manipulative. And then there's Shadow, who is basically a vulnerable teenager during the events of Sonic Adventure 2 through Shadow the Hedgehog. Despite the amount of time he's spent in stasis, mentally he acts around the same age as Sonic, which explains why he was more prone to manipulation by Dr. Eggman and Black Doom. There are many times where Eggman has taken advantage of Shadow's vulnerability and insecurity. In his eyes, Shadow is either a tool to use at his disposal or another thorn in his side. You might be thinking, well, Sonic doesn't fall for Eggman's manipulation tactics, so how could Shadow, of all characters, fall for them?
So, Shadow, you are the military's top secret weapon.
Let's start from the very beginning, where Eggman uncovers Shadow in Prison Island. Shadow introduces himself and tells Eggman that he can grant him one wish for awakening him. He defeats gun security and tells Eggman to find the Chaos Emeralds and meet him at the Space Colony Ark. Eggman hardly knows anything of Shadow and doesn't suspect his ulterior motives. Eggman never questions Shadow's intentions, and he views Shadow as just a weapon that his grandfather created, another tool to do his bidding and grant him his wish of taking over the world. After all, that is why Eggman risked his life by invading Prison Island. Perhaps he feels entitled to Shadow as his grandfather created him, and perhaps Eggman feels that whatever his grandfather left behind should belong to him, which also includes the Eclipse Cannon. For the most part, Eggman and Shadow's relationship is strictly business throughout the events of Sonic Adventure 2. The fact that both are related to Professor Gerald in some way is never outright discussed between the two. And again, I think Eggman views Shadow as a servant more than a family member. Eggman will give Shadow a command, and Shadow follows it without question. But as we know, Shadow had his own ulterior motives and wants to activate the Eclipse Cannon to avenge Maria and Professor Gerald. This is never really implied, but I do wonder if Shadow had some sort of fondness for Eggman, due to his family connection with Professor Gerald. I mean, they do look alike, so it would make sense that Shadow could easily follow Eggman's orders and not really give any pushback. What's interesting about analyzing Sonic Adventure 2's Dark Story is that Eggman and Shadow don't really share substantial interactions or a meaningful connection, despite both of them having family ties. I think the only time we see Eggman care about Shadow is when he tells him to get off of Prison Island before it blows up. I think this is the only instance that Eggman shows any concern for Shadow in this game. But again, I think this more so has to do with the fact that Eggman sees Shadow as a useful tool rather than genuinely caring about him. One moment that sticks out to me is when Eggman discovers that Team Sonic brought a fake Chaos Emerald with them. As Shadow begins to leave, Eggman stops him and says,
Wait, Shadow. I'm the one who should be telling them the end is near, not you. Now is the time to end this long drawn battle. This in history as the ultimate genius.
Again, Eggman is really only looking out for himself. But he does entrust Shadow to finish the job if anything were to happen to him. Of course, Eggman encourages Sonic and Shadow to stop the Bio-Lizard from destroying the Earth, but you know it's because it's out of self-interest to build his empire. In contrast, let's briefly take a look at Sonic and Shadow's relationship in this game. They were enemies from the very beginning, but when they teamed up to defeat the Bio-Lizard, their interactions were a lot more sincere than Shadow's interactions with Eggman. They check in on each other and ask if they're doing okay. They'll tell one another to collect more rings to replenish their strength. Shadow goes as far as to compliment Sonic and call him the ultimate life form. Even Sonic tells Shadow that everyone on Earth is waiting for both of them to return. It just feels like a more authentic bond than whatever Shadow and Eggman had. After Shadow's presumed death, Sonic ponders about him and everything that happened between them, while Eggman reflects on his grandfather's legacy. To be fair, I don't see that as a bad thing, but I think it's a subtle way of showing Eggman's biases and how that differs from Sonic and even Rouge. Based on what we can analyze thus far, Shadow and Eggman have a rather weak foundation, especially in comparison to what Shadow had with Sonic. Personally, I don't think Eggman truly cared about Shadow in Sonic Adventure 2. I suppose you could say the feeling is mutual on Shadow's side. But we have a lot of games to cover, so let's see how their relationship unfolds from here.
What did the doctor say about my memory?
Shadow and the real Eggman barely interact during Sonic Heroes. As you know, Metal Sonic is disguised as Eggman for most of the game. Shadow is suffering through amnesia, so he and the rest of Team Dark search for Eggman in hopes of finding answers. When Shadow asks the fake Eggman about his past, he responds with this.
Your memory? What memory? You have no past to remember.
What?
Well, I believe our time is up.
Of course, Shadow is taken aback by this response, and it causes him more turmoil. Despite Shadow knowing he is the ultimate life form, finding closure on his past is highly important to him. Even though this was just Metal Sonic, the real Eggman reuses this phrase in Shadow the Hedgehog. While Shadow and Eggman don't fully interact in Sonic Heroes, there are some implications of a parasitic relationship. One thing I'd like to point out is the fact that Eggman creates hundreds of Shadow androids, and he just keeps Shadow preserved in stasis. We don't know how long Shadow has been in stasis, but I would imagine it would be at least a few months. Eggman may have saved him, but Shadow did not consent to having hundreds of clones made after him. You can see that Shadow is visibly uncomfortable looking at a destroyed copy of himself. Team Dark's theme song, This Machine, is written from Shadow's point of view. Some of the lyrics seem to indicate that Shadow was somewhat conscious or aware that he was locked away. In the first verse, there is one particular lyric that I find chilling. Quote, "You could have left me here, sealed inside the pod. No one would ever know." Rouge could have left Shadow behind, or not even managed to accidentally find Shadow, and nobody would know. Life would continue on for everyone else, and Shadow and Omega would be stuck there. That is very unsettling to think about. The idea that your friends and loved ones think you're dead, but you're actually trapped somewhere and have no means of escaping. I think the song's chorus can be open to many interpretations, but I'm going to try my best to share what I think it means. We all danced in fire, trapped in this machine. Don't know how long we waited as the Eggman's watching. We all danced in fire, looking through the screen. Don't know how long we waited as the Eggman watches. Metaphorically, the term dancing in fire represents dealing with obstacles and struggles. I think this refers to the struggles that Shadow, Omega, and perhaps Rouge have had to face. I think this could also refer to the Shadow androids who have also been trapped. But I'm not certain about that because they don't seem to share Shadow's feelings or autonomy. The lyric, "Don't know how long we waited as the Eggman's watching," I think means that Shadow and Omega don't know how much time had passed while they were locked away. And I'm certain Eggman has surveillance cameras to keep an eye on Shadow and make sure that he stays contained. Also, Eggman watching could refer to the idea of him overseeing the production of his Shadow androids. Maybe he's monitoring Shadow's condition while he's creating his Shadow clone army. If you feel that my character themes are not fully accurate or canon to the game's story, or disagree with my interpretations, then that's fine. I personally believe that the Sonic character themes provide an insight to what the characters may be feeling or experiencing throughout the game. So that's why I wanted to briefly analyze this machine. One overlooked detail I wanted to point out is how Rouge managed to find out about Eggman's secret treasure. We know that Rouge is a well-trained spy and jewel thief. I imagine that she must have found out about this secret treasure by eavesdropping on Eggman or gaining access to his private diary logs. But all this time, Eggman's secret treasure was most likely Shadow, and Rouge had no idea. This is all speculative. We don't know how Rouge found out about Eggman's secret treasure, but if it's the case that Rouge found out through Eggman's journal entries, I think it's telling that Eggman would refer to Shadow as his secret treasure. Treasure being a valuable item that you own. This emphasizes that Eggman views Shadow as his possession and not as a person. Again, he didn't save Shadow because he likes him or thinks of him as his family. He preserved his body so he could make hundreds of Shadow clones. This is another action that proves he doesn't really care about Shadow and he's only interested in him for his power. I wonder, if Rouge never uncovered Shadow, how long would he have stayed trapped in stasis? Would Eggman have ever let Shadow free? And if he did, would he trick him into thinking that he was one of his creations? Well, based on the neutral pathway of Shadow the Hedgehog, that would probably be the outcome.
What I said about having created you, it was all a lie.
There is going to be a lot to unpack here. Shadow the Hedgehog, the game, is an interesting story to analyze. It has a lot of cutscenes and 11 different endings, with one of them being the true canon ending. Personally, I enjoy specific cutscenes of this game because we get to see Shadow's relationship with other characters develop, and at times, see him on the brink of a mental breakdown. Unfortunately, the well-executed cutscenes get overlooked due to this game's negative reputation. But we have a lot to analyze in regards to Shadow and Eggman's interactions. Now, before you say anything, I understand 10 of the endings are not the canon ending of Shadow the Hedgehog, and while we can speculate, we don't fully know what the true canon pathway is. Despite this, I think it's important to analyze all of the Shadow and Eggman cutscenes, regardless if it's the canon pathway or not. A significant portion of this game is about Shadow's relationship with Eggman. Whatever bond or connection they have begins to deteriorate in this game. In most cutscenes, Eggman will gaslight, manipulate, and threaten Shadow just so he can claim the Chaos Emeralds for himself. Now, before we dive in, I will use the term gaslighting quite a bit in this portion of the video. To be clear, I don't have a background in psychology, and I understand the term gaslighting has been thrown around a lot to the point where it kind of loses its meaning. So I want to ensure that I am using this term properly. According to Merriam-Webster, gaslighting is psychological manipulation of a person over an extended period of time that causes the victim to question the validity of their own thoughts, perception of reality, or memories, and typically leads to confusion, loss of confidence and self-esteem, uncertainty of one's emotional or mental stability, and a dependency on the perpetrator. In short, it's the act or practice of grossly misleading someone, especially for one's own advantage. I will apply these definitions to the examples of gaslighting we see throughout this game. If I counted correctly, Shadow the Hedgehog has a total of 5 Eggman missions and 7 Eggman boss fights. I'll mostly stick to analyzing the cutscenes, but to briefly cover the Eggman missions, these typically involve Eggman asking Shadow for favors like getting rid of gun robots or starting up his defenses. To no one's surprise, this is purely out of Eggman's self-interest and not for the sake of saving the planet. After completing Cryptic Castle, Shadow will find a Chaos Emerald. Before he could take it, he's stopped by Eggman. Since there's a lot more to dissect in this game, I'm going to play the entire cutscene and break everything down.
Another Chaos Emerald.
What are you doing here, Shadow?
Doctor, I don't want to fight with you, but I need those Chaos Emeralds. They hold the secret to my...
Enough of this nonsense! The Chaos Emeralds belong to me! All of them! No one gets in my way. Those who do will be destroyed. So stand clear or I will crush you, just as I will those black creatures.
In Cryptic Castle's Dark Mission, Shadow assists Eggman. But regardless if you help him, you still have to fight him. When I watched this cutscene after completing the Dark Mission for the first time, I thought it was strange that you would have to battle Eggman despite helping him. But given the context of their relationship and Eggman's character, it makes sense as to why Eggman would pick a fight with Shadow. From Eggman's perspective, just because Shadow helped him doesn't mean that he could do whatever he pleases and take his Chaos Emerald. Shadow tells Eggman that he doesn't want to fight, and he needs the Chaos Emerald to uncover his past. Based on his body language and tone of voice, you can tell this is highly important to Shadow. But Eggman cuts Shadow off and basically invalidates his needs and calls it nonsense. He threatens Shadow and claims that all of the Chaos Emeralds belong to him. He says that those who get in his way will be destroyed, and that if Shadow doesn't back down, he will crush him without hesitation. A common theme you'll see in these interactions is Eggman looming over Shadow with his machines. Eggman uses his contraptions to intimidate Shadow and make him feel small. As you can see, Shadow slightly flinches when Eggman demonstrates the power of his egg breaker. Fun fact, the music that plays during this cutscene is called Shut Your Mouth. This title perfectly fits Eggman's hostility toward Shadow at this moment. Eggman is basically telling Shadow to shut up and give him the Chaos Emerald. I always knew that Sonic Team was very purposeful on how they title their music to correlate with their games, but this still surprised me when I learned about it. There's also an Eggman boss fight after completing Mad Matrix. Mad Matrix is in the semi-hero / pure hero pathway. In the hero mission, Shadow teams up with SBO to invade Dr. Eggman's network.
So, I see you sneaky rats are back again, huh?
Damn, we've been detected.
Doctor, please tell me. I need to know about my past. Who am I? What am I doing here?
Are you still wondering who you are, Shadow? There's nothing to tell, Shadow. You have no past.
What?
Don't listen to him. He's just trying to trick you. You've got to focus. Destroy him and let's get out of here.
First thing I want to point out is Eggman calls Shadow and SBO sneaky rats. Obviously, Eggman is using rats as a derogatory term. I think rats are pretty cute, but whatever. Shadow brushes aside Eggman's comment, and out of desperation, he asks him about what he knows about his past. Of course, being the deceptive supervillain he is, Eggman attempts to trick Shadow into thinking that he has no past. Shadow is clearly affected by Eggman's response. Thankfully, Espio is there to call out Eggman's deception. Shadow gathers himself and prepares to battle Eggman. Again, Eggman uses his giant weapon to intimidate Shadow. One minor difference between this cutscene and the Cryptic Castle cutscene is that Shadow looks more grounded here. He doesn't flinch when Eggman attempts to scare him with his egg breaker. I think this is due to Espio being there to reassure him. But we're about to watch a scenario where Shadow doesn't get that validation. You know what's coming. If you are committed to a true neutral pathway, Shadow eventually arrives at the Iron Jungle searching for answers, only to be surprised at seeing hundreds of Shadow androids in front of him. Shadow is very confused, and this event puts his existence into question. Eggman approaches and delivers a brief speech to his army of Shadow clones. Shadow panics, and he begins to wonder if he's an android himself. If you continue the neutral pathway, Shadow's goal is to find Eggman for answers. When you complete Iron Jungle's neutral mission, Shadow and Omega will confront Eggman in the next cutscene. In my opinion, this is one of the best moments in the game.
Eggman detected. Approaching this direction.
Shadow and Omega? Why, you traitors! You two are going to stop me? Move aside!
Doctor, please, I need to know. Those androids, the ones that look like me, am I?
Yes.
What?
You and Omega are my creations. But you betray me as you stand here before me. So now, I will destroy you both, turning you into scrap metal!
Eggman, I will defeat you once and for all.
Shadow and Omega approach Dr. Eggman. Shadow is desperate for answers after he's seen numerous Shadow androids. You can see him clenching one of his hands as he anxiously waits for Eggman. I really like how the camera pans upward as we see Dr. Eggman approach the duo. Shadow and Omega look tiny in comparison to Eggman. I feel that this perfectly symbolizes the power imbalance and the little confidence that Shadow has left. And it's like he's hanging on to that last piece of his identity before he becomes a shell of his former self. Shadow frantically asks Eggman about the Shadow androids he saw and if this means he's an android himself. Eggman blatantly lies and claims that Shadow and Omega are his creations. He proceeds to tell them that he will throw them in the junkyard for betraying him. Shadow is clearly in shock by this fake revelation. He kneels down looking absolutely devastated. Unfortunately, Omega doesn't have the emotional comprehension to realize that Eggman is gaslighting Shadow into believing that he's an android. He's unable to reassure Shadow like Espio did. Again, Shadow looks so distraught. The poor boy is on the verge of a mental breakdown. What's interesting is that Eggman calls Shadow by his name at the beginning of the cutscene and not Shadow Android. I think this is Eggman trying to play his cards right. Going back to when Shadow sees android copies of himself, I sometimes feel that Eggman completely staged this scene. I feel that he probably knew Shadow was there, but wasn't fully convinced that he fooled Shadow. Knowing that Shadow's identity is important to him, Eggman waits for Shadow to bring it up, and that is when Eggman strikes. As you continue the neutral pathway, Shadow will arrive at Eggman's lava shelter. Shadow teams up with Omega in the hero mission, and their objective is to find Eggman.
Nice to see you, Shadow Android. And you too, Omega. It certainly looks as if you've, well, done quite a bit of damage down there. But did you really think that you could challenge me?
Dr. Eggman, I will destroy you and reign supreme.
Yes, Doctor. You will regret ever having created me. You're going straight to hell.
Why, you're nothing but pieces of scrap metal. Once I'm done with you, you'll be thrown in the junkyard. You will feel my wrath.
I don't care what anyone says. Shadow telling Eggman he's going straight to hell is one of the most badass Shadow moments in history. Eggman is furious and calls Shadow and Omega pieces of scrap metal and threatens to toss them in the junkyard once he's through with them. Eggman is really trying to emphasize that Omega and Shadow are easily disposable. But that doesn't work because Shadow defeats Eggman and takes the last Chaos Emerald from him.
Finally, I've got all the Chaos Emeralds.
I made you, and this is how you repay me?
I am Shadow Android, the ultimate battle lifeform created by Eggman. You may have created me, Doctor, but I will now lead this empire and androids will rule. This is who I am.
Eggman, target acquired. Locked and loaded. Fire.
What?
Goodbye, Doctor.
Eggman attempts to guilt Shadow for defeating his so-called creator. While Shadow doesn't listen to Eggman, what's so unfortunate is that Shadow actually believed Eggman's lie. He genuinely believes that he is a Shadow android and is literally a shell of his former self. As humorous as some fans find the neutral endings, the game takes on a much darker tone when you realize that Eggman gaslit Shadow to the point where he lost his true identity and his newfound purpose is based on a lie. The neutral pathway exposes how conniving Eggman truly is, but Eggman's manipulation tactics backfire on him because Shadow proceeds to kill him. If you complete Lava Shelter's Dark mission, Shadow assists Dr. Eggman in activating his volcanic defense systems. Interestingly, Eggman doesn't make any claims that Shadow is an android while you play through the stage. If thinking about it from the developer's perspective, they may have intentionally done this to keep the other pathways connected, though it still doesn't make a lot of sense. Anyway, I figured I'd point that out. In the pre-boss cutscene, Shadow approaches Dr. Eggman alone, and he still believes that he's one of Eggman's creations.
You did very well, Shadow Android. You have surpassed expectations, equal to that of the real Shadow. Excellent. Now give me those emeralds.
Never!
What?
I didn't collect them to hand them over to you. I collected them to destroy you.
How dare you? I created you. I gave you life. I gave you an order, or have you forgotten? Idiot! Perhaps I need to teach you a lesson!
The line equal to that of the real Shadow is just rubbing salt in the wound, especially because Eggman knows that this is all a lie and that Shadow's identity is important to him. Now that he believes that Shadow is under his control, he commands him to give him the Chaos Emeralds. However, even though Shadow believes that he's an android, he still defies Eggman and tells him that he plans to destroy him. This angers Eggman, and his response may hit close to home for those who have dealt with a narcissistic parent. Again, the game takes on a darker tone when you realize that a lot of people have been told similar things by a narcissistic family member. He calls Shadow an idiot, taking a jab at his ego and self-esteem. And while Eggman is berating Shadow, he uses his egg dealer to try and intimidate him, but it doesn't work because Shadow defeats him anyway.
Finally, I've got all the Chaos Emeralds.
I made you, and this is how you repay me?
I am Shadow Android, the ultimate life form, a copy of Shadow the Hedgehog. With the power of these emeralds, I will be stronger than him. This is who I am.
What?
Goodbye, Doctor.
Even while Eggman is down, he can't help but act entitled. The Japanese version isn't as heavy with the gaslighting and narcissism, but I like this Eggman line in particular.
I created you, and yet you dare bite the hand that fed you?
Both versions show Eggman attempting to guilt Shadow, but again, it doesn't work. Shadow then gathers the Chaos Emeralds, and this is the result of Eggman's gaslighting. Shadow believes that he is an android copy of himself. Once again, Shadow kills Eggman. Shadow will face Eggman if he completes the Dark mission for Cosmic Fall in the semi-hero pathway. At this point in the storyline, the Gun Commander confronts Shadow and shares his version of events. Shadow continues his search for the truth and wonders how he can fulfill his promise to the Ark victims. In the pre-boss cutscene, Eggman drops in with his egg dealer machine and demands the Chaos Emeralds from Shadow.
Shadow,
Doctor?
hand those 6 Chaos Emeralds to me, like a good boy. You were once a great invention from my grandfather's past, but this is my time. Give me the Chaos Emeralds, and I will spare your life.
Doctor,
What?
this is something I must do on my own. I must uncover the truth. I made a promise to all the victims aboard the Ark.
This is nonsense. You will obey me, or there will be dire consequences.
I want to discuss the line, hand those 6 Chaos Emeralds to me like a good boy. I'm sure you may think I'm overanalyzing, but I've always found this line to be interesting. The phrase, like a good boy, is Eggman's way of emphasizing that he is the authority figure and Shadow should submit to him. It also comes off as very condescending. He then goes on to say how Shadow was once a great invention from his grandfather's past, but now it's his time to shine. The oh-so-generous Eggman tells Shadow that he'll spare his life if he's given all the Chaos Emeralds. Shadow tells Eggman that he made a promise to all the victims aboard the Ark. Shadow is communicating to Eggman how important it is for him to uncover the truth. And yet Eggman responds with, "This is nonsense," completely dismissing and invalidating Shadow's needs. He then threatens Shadow, telling him that if he doesn't obey him, there will be dire consequences. I know I sound like a broken record, but I have to point out, while Eggman is speaking, he uses his machine to intimidate Shadow. Again, he's trying to enforce that he's much bigger than Shadow and can easily crush him. And in this instance, you can see Shadow flinching when Eggman threatens him. Even after the fight, Eggman attempts to make Shadow feel guilty for hurting him, Professor Gerald's grandson. He calls him an ungrateful little pest.
Finally, I've got all the Chaos Emeralds.
You ungrateful little pest. Have you forgotten that it was my grandfather who created you?
I am Shadow the Hedgehog, the ultimate life form, born and raised aboard the Ark. I shall live on. I am the protector of the Ark. I am living proof of the ultimate life form. This is who I am.
What?
Leave now and never return. I won't allow anyone to violate the sacred Ark.
I really like how the Japanese dub phrased this line. It translates to,
Have you forgotten the debt of gratitude you owe to my grandfather for creating you?
both versions emphasize Eggman's entitlement toward Shadow, and again, this is something that many of us have heard from our own family. The idea that we owe our parents gratitude because they gave birth to us, even if they mistreated us or crossed our boundaries, and that we can't stand up for ourselves because that's an act of defiance in their eyes. Eggman rubs it in Shadow's face that it was his grandfather that created him, and he's an ungrateful little pest for going against him. Going against his own family. Eggman is implying,
My grandfather created you. If you really loved him, you wouldn't be hurting his family.
but Eggman's words don't faze Shadow. He snaps at Eggman and tells him to leave the Ark. One thing that we could learn from Shadow is just because Eggman's grandfather created him doesn't mean he owes the family anything. Shadow has the right to be his own person and search for his purpose. What's great about this scene is Shadow realizes that Eggman is not his ally. He snaps back at Eggman and reestablishes his boundaries. He cuts him out of his life and tells him to never come back. In this strange way, there's something liberating about that. But at the same time, this ending is tragic because Shadow is choosing to live a life where he remains stuck in the past. Even though Shadow wants to fulfill his promise, There's just no feasible way to bring justice to the Ark victims. We know this is not something Maria would have wanted for Shadow, but it's a beautiful ending nonetheless. A sad, beautiful, tragic one. If you assist Knuckles and complete the Black Comet's hero mission, the Semi-Dark Pathway, Shadow will fight Eggman instead of Sonic and the Gun Commander.
Shadow!
Doctor?
Hand those 6 Chaos Emeralds to me, like a good boy. You were unleashed to find the emeralds. Excellent job, Shadow. You've done well. Now hand them over.
Not a chance.
What?
I need these emeralds to help me uncover my past. They're not going anywhere.
Well then, we'll just see about that. Shadow, prepare yourself.
Once again, Eggman demands Shadow to give him the Chaos Emeralds like a good boy. Out of all of the Eggman pathways, this is where Shadow sounds the most confident in himself. This genuinely catches Eggman by surprise, and he's unsure of what to say or how to manipulate him. While Eggman tries to come off as menacing, his response pales in comparison to the previous cutscenes we watched. If we think about Eggman's relationship to Shadow in Sonic Adventure 2, Shadow was fairly subdued when he was around him. He never lost his temper or gave any indication that he would fight back. So Eggman doesn't really have the tools he needs to manipulate characters that are more confident and sure of themselves, which is one of the many reasons why he struggles with Sonic so much. When Eggman is defeated, all he can say is, "How dare you defy me?" Emphasis on the me.
Finally, I've got all the Chaos Emeralds.
How dare you defy me?
I am Shadow the Hedgehog. I and only I know what is best. No one can tell me what to do. This is who I am.
What?
Goodbye, Doctor.
While he doesn't bring up Professor Gerald, Eggman displays self-entitlement toward Shadow. You can tell Eggman wasn't expecting Shadow to disobey him. As Shadow collects all of the Chaos Emeralds, he says that he's the only one who knows best and no one can tell him what to do. And then he proceeds to kill Eggman. Again. Before we dive into the last way, I find it really interesting that Shadow kills Eggman in 3 of the 4 scenarios. On the other hand, he never directly kills Sonic, though I'm sure it's implied that Sonic would eventually die in the Pure Dark and Semi-Dark endings. It just really makes you wonder. The other part of it is how Eggman is so surprised when Shadow is about to kill him. It's like he didn't even consider it a possibility. Maybe that's due to his narcissism or inability to gauge how far he can push someone without facing any consequences. In the last way, Sonic, Eggman, and friends rally behind Shadow as he confronts Black Doom. One notable moment during the final boss is when Eggman checks in with Shadow one last time and says,
Shadow, can you hear me? This might be the last chance I have to speak to you, so what I said about having created you, it was all a lie. Everyone thought you died during that horrible incident, but I rescued you with one of my robots. You'd lost your memory, that's all. You really are the ultimate life form my grandfather created.
Yes, Eggman finally admits that Shadow isn't an android after all, and it was just a silly little prank. While Eggman doesn't apologize, you can hear some guilt in his voice. I find the way he phrases his words quite interesting. By stating that he rescued him from the fall and keeping him in stasis, it seems like he doesn't want to take full accountability for his actions. He still lied to Shadow, and that wasn't okay. Eggman might say this to try and give Shadow some motivation to keep fighting. Or he actually does feel sorry and wants to do at least one good thing before death. Based on the tone of his voice, I'm inclined to believe that he does feel guilty, but he just can't bring himself to actually say that he's sorry. I am a true believer that actions speak louder than words. Yes, Eggman preserved Shadow, but instead of letting him live his life, Eggman cloned Shadow to create hundreds of Shadow androids that will be subservient to him. I also find it telling that he doesn't say that he's sorry. It's like Eggman wants credit for saving Shadow, which is something that anyone else would have done if they found him. In Shadow the Hedgehog, you can unlock Expert Mode by A-ranking every mission. In this mode, it's confirmed that Shadow joined Gun and is currently going through training. Each character will give Shadow a brief message while he is completing the stage, including the President and Gun Commander. In the Iron Jungle stage, Eggman leaves this short message.
Shadow, it's me again. Are you upset with me for something?
This implies that Shadow is avoiding Dr. Eggman. I wonder why. I can imagine that Shadow is upset with Eggman for not just lying to him, but trying to take away his identity. Shadow's identity is highly important to him, and for Eggman to try to gaslight him into thinking he's just an android infuriates him. I think at this point, Shadow realizes that Eggman is very controlling, and Shadow is not one who wants to be controlled. Eggman would not respect Shadow's boundaries in the slightest, and Shadow realizes that as he's going through gun training. And that's why you don't really see them work together very much. I've seen a few fans wonder why there wasn't an ending where Shadow partnered with Eggman, but given how Eggman has treated Shadow, why would he want to? Why would he want to subject himself to such abusive treatment? One thing that is so intriguing is that regardless if you choose to help Eggman in the lava shelter, Shadow will still defy him. In a way, he's going against the player's wishes. If you're making the choice to work with Eggman, it's most likely because you want to see a scenario where Shadow teams up with him. This is the only time he does the opposite of the player's desired outcome. For example, if you decided to help Sonic in the last Pure Hero level, Shadow will side with Sonic in the ending. The same thing applies with Black Doom. Shadow doesn't make the choice to betray Black Doom if you completed the final Black Doom missions. And yet, out of all of the final stages, there is only one Eggman mission, and regardless of your choice, Shadow still refuses to side with him. If there was a pathway where Shadow and Eggman teamed up, I don't think that partnership would last very long. Eggman doesn't seem very trusting of Shadow. That doesn't have anything to do with Shadow's character, that is just Eggman's nature. He inevitably double-crosses people as soon as they lose value to him. Shadow has a strong moral compass, and he refuses to do anything that goes against his values. Given that Shadow and Eggman have conflicting goals, it would be inevitable for Shadow to rebel, or for Eggman to betray him. It seems that the only way to have Shadow by his side is to convince him that he's one of his creations. And of course, that ends up backfiring. Shadow the Hedgehog shows how manipulative Eggman truly is, and sadly, it gets overlooked by fans and critics. I know people like to make fun of this game, and there are definitely things to poke fun at, but Shadow's interactions and relationships with other Sonic characters is why I find this game so compelling, despite all of its flaws. The people that Shadow surrounds himself with have an influence on his morals, ambitions, and mental health. In the Eggman endings, Shadow is either stuck in the past, angry, or a hollow shell of his former self. In contrast, Shadow is at his happiest during the Pure Hero endings. This proves that Eggman is a harmful influence on Shadow. There isn't much to say about Sonic Battle. Shadow and Eggman do not directly interact, though they both speak negatively of each other. Yes, this game was released before Shadow the Hedgehog and even Sonic Heroes, but based on the writing, it sounds like it takes place after the events of Shadow the Hedgehog. There has been some debate on whether Sonic Battle is truly canon, and if you personally believe that it's not canon to the timeline, then I won't hold that against you. Also, I understand that Sonic Battle is quite underrated and not many fans know about this game. For those who are unfamiliar about Sonic Battle's story, you could watch my video essay on it, but just a warning, it's about 2 hours long. Though I highly recommend you play the game for yourself, as it's one of the best Sonic stories the series has. But I'll provide a quick synopsis for you here. Dr. Eggman finds a powerful weapon called the Gazoid, but he's unable to get it to work and tosses it on the beach. Sonic later discovers it and names the robot Emerald. Sonic and friends raise Emerald and give him Chaos Emeralds to make him stronger and more intelligent. Shadow realizes that Emerald is a destructive war machine and wants to destroy him. But he gets attacked by one of Eggman's robots and is out of commission for a good chunk of the story. But he eventually joins Sonic in fatherhood, so that's great, I guess. In the beginning of Shadow's chapter, Dr. Eggman briefly speaks about Shadow. He complains to himself that Sonic's friends have given Emerald 6 of the 7 Chaos Emeralds, though Shadow has the last one, and he's certain that he wouldn't give it away.
He believes that he is the ultimate form of life. His chaos control.
While there is no voice acting, I feel that Eggman was saying that in a resentful tone. Interestingly, Eggman anticipates Shadow to side with Sonic and potentially give Emerald the last Chaos Emerald. To prepare for that, Eggman has a backup plan to get Emerald under his control. In the last chapter, Eggman destroys a cluster of stars, and this overrides Emerald's programming and he becomes unstable. Shadow, along with Sonic and friends, is very blindsided by Eggman's surprise attack. In Shadow's case, he grew close to Emerald and was starting to become more trusting. But Eggman took that friendship away from him. Shadow is in such a state of shock that he's unable to fight and asks Sonic to save Emerald.
I am no longer. You must go, Sonic.
Given his past and everything that happened with Maria, poor Shadow is probably traumatized by all of this. One thing I'd like to point out, while Dr. Eggman isn't directly targeting Shadow, his actions still have an effect on him. And we'll continue to see more examples like these as we progress through the games.
I'll have the last laugh. Remember that.
There is something interesting to me about Sonic 06. Eggman hardly interacts with Shadow in comparison to Sonic. In fact, there are only 2 Eggman cutscenes in Shadow's story. The first being a confrontation in the Kingdom Valley ruins. Eggman unleashes his robots on Shadow and Rouge in hopes of getting the Scepter of Darkness back. Of course, the Scepter of Darkness shatters and Mephiles is released. However, this next Shadow and Eggman cutscene always stuck out to me. I'm going to play this cutscene in its entirety and then break down the dialogue and animations.
Wouldn't the door have been easier? So, what do you want now?
Who is Mephiles, and why are you trying to capture him?
If you want to know, you should go find him yourself. But here's a hint. It's all linked to the Soliana disaster 10 years ago.
The Solaris Project.
Indeed. When you capture Mephiles, you must bring him to me. Then I'll tell you the truth about Solaris.
The cutscene kicks off with Shadow breaking through Eggman's pod from the ceiling. Interestingly, Eggman doesn't act surprised or angry like he would with Sonic. He gives no reaction to Shadow. All he says is, "Wouldn't the door have been easier?" I believe that Eggman is trying to make Shadow feel stupid, make him feel like he didn't think this one through, and that he did all of this work for nothing and could have just gone through the door like any other normal person. I'm sure Eggman has security cameras and figured that Shadow was coming. Knowing that Shadow prides himself in being the ultimate life form, Eggman tries to take a jab at Shadow's ego. He wants Shadow to know that he thinks he's not a big deal. Eggman then casually turns around and says, "So what do you want now?" "What do you want, Shadow? You're being an annoying pest and you're wasting my time." Despite Eggman's attempts to dissuade Shadow, this doesn't crack him and he gets straight to business. He asks him about Mephiles and why he was so interested in capturing him. Eggman stands up, turns his back towards Shadow, and responds, "If you want to know, you should go find him yourself." Interestingly, Shadow does not respond to this. He doesn't argue back or question Eggman. I can't emphasize enough on how casual Eggman is acting. Eggman is using information as a bargaining chip. My observation is that he's stringing Shadow along in hopes that Shadow will continue doing what he says. If you bring Mephiles to me, I'll tell you more about Solaris. I think Shadow isn't acting very confident either. As Eggman sits down, Shadow is avoiding eye contact with him. He nods, indicating that he agrees to Eggman's command. Again, I think this is Eggman's way of gauging how much control he has over Shadow. Can he still get Shadow to do favors for him? Or, at the very least, can he still keep Shadow from ruining his plans? Now, Shadow doesn't help Eggman after this, but he doesn't stop him either. After this conversation, Eggman kidnaps Elise, again, while Shadow is trying to fight one of Sonic's battles. Shadow actually lets him off the hook. Eggman was right there, defenseless. Shadow had an opportunity to take out Eggman, but he couldn't. In fact, I have seen some fans complain about how Shadow could have just stopped Eggman then and there. But I feel this criticism overlooks the power dynamic that's at play here. I believe this cutscene demonstrates that Eggman still holds some power over Shadow. Keep in mind, Shadow tends to be more violent than Sonic, and yet Eggman acts blasé around him. He doesn't feel threatened by Shadow in the slightest. He can read him like a book. He knows why Shadow is trying to confront him. He knows that Shadow wants something and, in a way, relies on Eggman to give him the information he needs. Eggman is so calm, cool, and collected because he knows that Shadow won't do anything to him. He knows that he still has some power over Shadow. Maybe not much, but he knows that he still has something to hold over his head. Also, him commanding Shadow to bring Mephiles back to him shows that he still views him as a tool. At this point, it's established that Eggman's way of manipulating Shadow is dangling information over his head, whether it's answers to his identity or finding useful information. And occasionally, he seems to imply that Shadow has no right defying him because he's Professor Gerald's grandson. But as time marches on, this manipulation tactic loses its effectiveness.
Doctor, what are you doing here?
The Sonic Rivals games are quite underrated in comparison to the other mainstream Sonic games. Sonic Rivals 1 and 2 were released on the PSP, and because of that, it didn't sell very well. So a lot of Sonic fans don't really know about the Rivals series. With that being said, I'm going to try to summarize the story as best as I can. Basically, Eggman has a descendant named Eggman Negative. Eggman Negative is basically Silver's Eggman, though technically he was Blaze's antagonist in the Sonic Rush series. But forget about that. Eggman Negative is from the future and has such contempt towards the original Eggman. He believes that Dr. Eggman is an absolute failure and has ruined the great Robotnik name. So Eggman Negative's sole purpose is to undo all of the damage Eggman has caused towards the Robotnik family name. How does he do that? He turns Eggman into a playing card! Sonic Rivals 1 and 2 are the last games that he has major relevance in, and from there he only appears in the Mario and Sonic Olympic Games. But why, though? He has no right to be participating in the Olympics. Anyway, now that we have that out of the way, let's take a look at Shadow and Eggman's interactions in Sonic Rivals. Eggman sends a transmission to Shadow begging him for his help, though he has trouble explaining the situation he's in. 6 hours later, Shadow realizes that Eggman is truly missing. Interesting that Shadow didn't immediately track Eggman. He basically let 6 hours pass before doing anything. Perhaps he didn't fully believe him or thought it was a trap. And Shadow has every right to feel that way based on his past experiences with him. He eventually runs into Eggman Negative, who is just disguised as the original Eggman. Silver also happens to be there. In this cutscene, Eggman Negative tries to gaslight Shadow.
So, was this who you were warning me about in your transmission?
Transmission? What are you talking about?
What? 6 hours ago, you asked for my help.
Why would I ask you for your help?
What? Why are you...
I feel like Shadow is reliving his past trauma with Eggman. Eggman Negative challenges Silver and Shadow to a battle. In the post-boss cutscene, Shadow reflects on what just happened.
The doctor's acting strange. It makes no sense, but this has nothing to do with me.
I really love this line. I love that Shadow reassures himself that he hasn't done anything to make Eggman act this way. It shows personal growth and that Shadow is becoming more secure with himself. I know it's just a simple line, but it's really nice to see that he's not letting Eggman's words get to him. I think at this point, Shadow knows better when someone's trying to manipulate him. Eventually, Shadow recovers the real Eggman and gets the truth from Silver. Eggman helps them by taking them to Eggman Negative's space base. Shadow wins. The end. In Sonic Rivals 2, Eggman is in trouble yet again. He sends Metal Sonic to Shadow and asks for assistance. Understandably, Shadow is not very trusting of Eggman's intentions, but he realizes the fate of the world is at stake, so he teams up with Dr. Eggman. Or rather, he teams up with Metal Sonic. During the events of this game, Shadow does seem to care about Metal Sonic, but he doesn't show that same kindness towards Eggman. In fact, Eggman and Shadow's conversations are pretty brief. Eggman will give Shadow information, and Shadow will move forward with his mission. Occasionally, Shadow shows disdain towards Eggman. He even calls him an egghead at one point.
Now, what do we have here? A little forest expedition?
Is that the doctor? Metal Sonic, which one of those eggheads is that?
Moments like these demonstrate that Shadow is really only doing this to save the world from Eggman Negative. He doesn't like Eggman, he's just tolerating him for the time being. But he always takes the time to check in with Metal Sonic and asks if he's doing okay. Funny enough, Metal Sonic and Shadow are the true heroes of Sonic Rivals 2, along with Silver and Espio. Shadow and Eggman may never fully fix their relationship, but it's endearing to see Shadow bond with Metal Sonic. Believe it or not, Sonic Rivals 2 marks the last time Shadow helps Eggman in the main Sonic timeline. Sonic Boom doesn't count. One thing that is so unique about the Sonic Rivals series is how kind Eggman is towards Shadow. But don't let that fool you into thinking Eggman is beginning to respect Shadow as a person. Eggman is being nice because he has to be. Manipulating or insulting Shadow would not help his situation in any way. Eggman has done this time and time again when his life is at risk. As things return to the status quo, Eggman acts disrespectful towards Shadow. The truth of it all is, Shadow is insignificant to Eggman. He said so himself. Remember in Sonic Generations when Shadow was there to side with Sonic instead of Eggman?
You've got this, Sonic.
You can win, Sonic.
Who are they? They are insignificant.
Do not underestimate the Doctor's scientific ability.
At this point, Eggman drops the pleasantries. He probably realized that Shadow will never trust him again. We see Shadow and Eggman briefly interact in Sonic Forces. Obviously, Shadow is another thorn in Eggman's side, and he doesn't even hide it. He's not thrilled with Shadow invading one of his bases. However, despite Shadow being the ultimate life form, Eggman still views Sonic as his biggest threat. Of course, this is where Shadow runs into Infinite and beats the shit out of him. Then Infinite's like, "Karma is real, look what you made me do." And then he entered his better than revenge era. Sorry, that was a lot of Taylor Swift references. It's a waste of time to manipulate Shadow by dangling bits of information over his head because it doesn't work anymore. and Eggman knows that. However, endangering the lives of the people Shadow cares about is a much more effective tactic. Shadow may not fully admit it, but Omega and Sonic are individuals he truly cares about. And guess who Infinite targets? Omega and Sonic. Again, Sonic is the biggest threat for Eggman, but Sonic presumed dead seems to indirectly affect Shadow, because he goes on a 6-month bereavement leave. Well, that's what I theorize, because the writers don't explicitly say what Shadow's been doing during those 6 months. We know that he escaped virtual reality before Sonic's attack, and it doesn't seem like he was trying to fight Eggman because the Resistance was under the impression that Shadow was working with Eggman. And if he was fighting Eggman's army, then the Resistance would have definitely caught on at some point. But yeah, for 6 whole months, Sonic's friends believe that Shadow is on Eggman's side. But all's well that ends well. Shadow saves Sonic just in time and ends up siding with him. We love a supportive rival. Look at him smile. Sonic Forces doesn't provide anything new with Shadow and Eggman's relationship. But again, we see that Eggman's actions do have a negative effect on Shadow. Before we move on, I'd like to briefly complain about the marketing for Sonic Forces. The marketing for this game made it seem like Shadow was partnering with Eggman for some unknown reason. Of course, they did this to get fans interested in the game, and people love Sonic and Shadow's rivalry. I was frustrated with that because it's not an accurate representation of Shadow's relationship with Eggman or even Sonic. If you look at the main Sonic timeline, Shadow inevitably teams up with Sonic to defeat Eggman or the larger threat at hand. Do they have battles? Yes, every now and then. But to say that Shadow would rather partner with Eggman completely disregards the hell that Eggman put Shadow through during the events of Sonic Heroes through Sonic 06.
All that love for someone who is gone when I was right there!
As we analyze this timeline, we see Shadow growing more distant and resentful towards Eggman. However, Eggman was hostile towards Shadow from the beginning of Shadow 05. But why does Eggman act this way towards Shadow? I believe Eggman's contempt towards Shadow stems much deeper than his plans being foiled. Eggman may have some resentment towards Maria, and he directs all of that anger and frustration at Shadow. In Sonic Frontiers, you can listen to these egg memos while fishing with our dear Big the Cat. One memo specifically references Maria and how Eggman feels about her.
I never really knew my cousin Maria. Everyone spoke of her like she was very special. All that love for someone who is gone when I was right there! But I have to wonder, back then, was she anything like Sage is now?
This memo confirms that Eggman did not get a lot of attention growing up, as his family was grief-stricken over Maria, and perhaps Professor Gerald as well. Eggman probably felt neglected as a child and grew bitter over time. Despite his feelings towards Maria, he clearly looked up to his grandfather. It's not confirmed if Eggman actually met his grandfather, but I'm inclined to believe that Eggman was alive when the gun raid happened. Though I would imagine that Eggman was very young, an age where he would vaguely remember his cousin, but wasn't fully aware of his grandfather's projects until he was much older. Instead of saying, "I never met my cousin Maria," he says, "I never really knew my cousin Maria," possibly meaning that she was alive when he was born, and they may have met once or twice before she lived on the Space Colony Ark. When you consider how Eggman idolized his grandfather, it begins to make sense why all of that hostility and resentment is directed at Shadow. Shadow was very close to Maria and Professor Gerald. I think it's safe to say that he was closer to Professor Gerald than Eggman could ever dream to be. I would imagine that Eggman is envious of Shadow. The fact that Shadow was able to have that family connection with Professor Gerald, whereas Eggman may have never physically met his grandfather. When you think about it, Professor Gerald must have been residing in the Space Colony Ark for many years doing research. He may have never returned to Earth until he was sent to Prison Island. let's briefly take a look at the Sonic IDW comics, specifically issue 6. Apologies to any Archie Sonic fans watching. The reason why I'm not covering the Archie comics is because there's so many of them, and honestly, I would rather have this video come out this year. For those who have not read the IDW comics, they're kind of considered canon, I think. That's what head writer Ian Flynn indirectly confirmed. In addition, Sonic Frontiers makes a couple of references to the IDW comics. Though Sega of Japan has gone back and forth on which Sonic media is canon and which isn't. Despite that, I think there are quite a few Shadow and Eggman moments that are worth discussing. Like Sonic Battle, Shadow and Eggman don't directly interact, at least not yet, though it's apparent that Shadow is not fond of Eggman. The Sonic IDW comics take place after Sonic Forces, and in the beginning of the series, Eggman loses his memory and identifies as Mr. Tinker. Mr. Tinker is basically the complete opposite of Eggman. He's very kind and enjoys making toys for children. He loves being a part of a community and making his neighbors happy. Sonic meets Team Chaotix and they're conflicted on what to do with Mr. Tinker. They wonder if it's right to punish, or in this case, kill someone who has committed horrendous atrocities in the past when they're suffering from amnesia and is a completely different person now. But when Mr. Tinker meets Sonic, he brings up the name Eggman Land. This is concerning for Sonic and the others because the Eggman Land they're familiar with is a horrible place that has caused so many game overs and broken controllers. Shadow the anti-hero appears and is set on stopping Eggman Tinker from building this mysterious Eggman Land project. Sonic tries to convince Shadow not to kill Mr. Tinker by pinning him against the wall and subsequently chasing him in the sunset. I wish I were joking. It's not explicitly stated if Shadow truly believes that Mr. Tinker is telling the truth, but regardless, it doesn't matter to him. He doesn't want to risk the possibility of Eggman doing something horrible again. He even reminds Sonic that Eggman has tried to kill him multiple times, and yet Sonic still wants to give him a chance. I don't know how he does it, but Sonic looks at Shadow a certain way, and then Shadow decides to go along with Sonic's plan. I'm half joking. Sonic points out that if they're going to kill Eggman, shouldn't they also kill Shadow because he tried to destroy the world at some point as well? Personally, I don't find Sonic's argument very convincing because we have seen Shadow change for the better, while Eggman has stayed the same until he got amnesia. It baffles me how he could equate the two, and I'm offended for Shadow. If Sonic had said that to me, I would have punched him in the face. So that's why I think it's all in the prolonged eye contact and not his shitty debate bro talking points. What's intriguing about this conversation is that Shadow was set on killing Eggman, and yet Sonic is the one who stops him. Despite their differences, he gives in to Sonic and he trusts him. This is an example of how strong Sonic and Shadow's relationship has become. Even when the trust gets broken during the Metal Virus saga, they sort of make up afterwards and work together again. Whereas with Eggman, there is no trust, and it won't ever come back. That's one of the many reasons why I feel Shadow's relationship with Sonic is a great foil to his relationship with Eggman. I know I sound like a broken record, but the whole reason why Eggman awakened Shadow from stasis was to use him as his personal weapon, and his view of Shadow doesn't really change. In Sonic Battle, there is a very candid moment between Sonic and Shadow. Sonic tells Shadow that he believes he has a heart and isn't just some weapon. No matter how many times they've fought, Sonic still views him as someone with a heart and feelings and compassion. Now, if you want to pair them as rivals or boyfriends, that's your personal headcanon. But I really want to emphasize that Sonic has seen Shadow at his worst, and yet he still sticks around and supports him when he needs it the most. And as the timeline progresses, Shadow slowly grows to trust Sonic more and genuinely care about him, as he does with Rouge and Omega. Eggman has also seen Shadow at his worst, and he wants him to stay that way, just so he can control him. Control plays a huge factor in Eggman's relationships. He's manipulated Knuckles on several occasions so he can have access to the Master Emerald. He attempts to control Princess Elise so he can harness the flames of disaster. Even in Sonic Lost World, Eggman's purpose for visiting the Lost Hex was to control a bunch of Zeti and use them to do his bidding. To go off on a brief tangent, but part of the reason why Eggman despises Sonic is because he can't control him. In their 30-year history, Eggman has never successfully controlled Sonic. He created Metal Sonic in hopes of replacing him, but even his robot copy falls short of the real thing. Eggman has successfully manipulated Knuckles, he gaslit Shadow, he's been able to control gods, and yet he has never succeeded at doing any of those things with Sonic. Going back on topic, I think Eggman could see that behind his cold and tough exterior, deep down Shadow is actually sensitive, a little soft even, and Eggman takes advantage of that. In Shadow the Hedgehog and arguably Sonic 06, Eggman views Shadow as this vulnerable kid that he can condition into doing his bidding. Sonic definitely doesn't agree with Shadow half of the time, but he never tries to control him or manipulate him into doing things his way. That's not to say they don't have any bad moments. Sonic can be a bit toxic to Shadow. Him implying that Shadow and Eggman's actions are equivalent in IDW issue 6 did not sit right with me, especially because Shadow has made the effort to change for the better, but you do eventually see them try to resolve the issue and reconcile, even though they're both really bad at communicating their feelings. It's kind of ironic how Shadow was enemies with Sonic and was on Eggman's side in the very beginning. And now it's mostly reversed. As Shadow grows more confident of himself, it's much harder for Eggman to manipulate him. Although, before I forget, in the most recent issue, Eggman brings back the Shadow androids and shows no remorse about it. So add this to the list of horrible things that Eggman has done to Shadow. Of course, this bothers Shadow, but he's able to hold his own and do quite a bit of fighting. At the time of making this video, we have yet to see Shadow and Eggman directly interact in Sonic Prime. However, based on the brief moments we see of Shadow, I think it's safe to say that Shadow dislikes Eggman in Prime. One moment that sticks out to me is when Sonic tricks Shadow into thinking Eggman is behind him, and the poor boy falls for it. Shadow views Eggman as a bigger threat, but is understandably annoyed with Sonic's antics and recklessness. My prediction is that Shadow and Sonic have the same goal of stopping Eggman, but they both have different approaches, and that is what will cause them to butt heads. I'm hoping Shadow does interact with Eggman, or the Council at some point. I'm definitely curious to see how their relationship is handled. It will also be interesting to see how the third movie will portray Shadow and Eggman's relationship. We know that movie Eggman is manipulative and will double-cross anyone as soon as they lose their value. I wonder if Eggman will attempt to double-cross Shadow, or if Shadow double-crosses Eggman first, and Eggman doesn't know how to handle the betrayal because he's always been the betrayer, not the betrayee. I think Shadow's relationship with Eggman is an unconventional example of a toxic relationship with a narcissistic family member. Both of them being related to Maria and Professor Gerald was the only thing that kept this relationship intact. You would think that their bond would be strong, especially when they worked together in the beginning, but as time went on, their relationship fell apart. You can see that this was all Eggman's doing. Even after the events of Sonic Adventure 2 and Sonic Heroes, Shadow was willing to help out Eggman at times. And yet, Eggman has said really horrible things to him, and even tried to take away his identity. Arguably the one thing that is most important to Shadow. But the most mind-blowing thing to me is, even after all of that, Shadow still helped Eggman during the events of Sonic Rivals 1 and 2. For the sake of the world, Shadow was willing to partner with his worst enemy, and arguably one of his abusers. I think that says a lot about his character, and I definitely feel he doesn't get enough credit for that. While it's not explicitly shown in any of the cutscenes, Shadow begins to pull back and avoid Eggman. Understandably, he had enough and doesn't want anything to do with him. And while technically Shadow has not cut off Eggman from communication, the only time he's after Eggman is to stop his evil plans. Had Eggman treated Shadow like an actual family member, things might have been different. One thing I was surprised to see was the amount of dialogue that could apply to people's real-life experiences. So many people have been told by their parents phrases like, "I gave you life," "I gave you a roof over your head, and this is how you repay me." I think that's why some of Eggman's lines from Shadow the Hedgehog can really hit close to home. Personally, I find it shocking that their relationship gets overlooked in the Sonic community, and that's why I felt the need to make a video like this. Many Sonic fans don't take Shadow 05 and Sonic 06 seriously due to its reputation. But these two games have the best examples of how manipulative Eggman truly is. These two games also show how vulnerable Shadow can be, and how Eggman takes advantage of that. What's so beautiful about Shadow's character progression is how he overcomes all the hardships and becomes his own person, and is more confident of himself. He expanded his toolbox and knows when he's being manipulated and knows how to handle that. Honestly, I find that really inspiring. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel. I also want to give a huge thank you to Flascenco Cipher and Ted Hazard for voicing Shadow and Eggman respectively for certain parts of the video, as well as Moralitas, who created the thumbnail. She really brought my vision to life. These people are amazingly talented, and please do show them your support, give them some love, and follow them on their social media. And of course, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I'm curious to know how you guys feel about Shadow and Eggman's relationship. Do you relate to Shadow in some way? I'd love to hear what you think. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.